The air in containment cell 734 tasted of nothing. It was a manufactured void, scrubbed of dust, of life, of scent, recycled through 100 filters until it was as sterile as the polished chrome floor and the seamless polymer walls. It was the only air Kale had ever known. He sat on the edge of the cot, a simple plinth that retracted into the wall, his spine straight, his hands resting on his knees, palms up, in the precise posture of compliance. The light was a constant, shadowless glow, emanating from the ceiling itself, erasing texture and depth, making the small room feel both infinite and suffocating. He measured time not by the sun, for he had never seen it, but by the subtle shifts in the hum of the facility's life support, the soft chime that announced nutrient delivery, and the silent slide of the door that heralded the arrival of a handler. For 17 years, this rhythm had been his world, a metronome ticking away a life that felt less lived than observed. His designation was Subject 734, an omega of unique genetic provenance, the dossiers stated, a valuable asset. He had read snippets of his own file on a technician's unguarded datapad once, his eyes scanning the clinical text with a detached curiosity. Pheromonal latency, high stress response threshold, ideal for Project Chimera. The words were as tasteless as the air, abstract labels for the flesh and bone and blood that was him. He was not a person. He was a project. He was a function. He had learned this lesson before he had learned his own name, a name he had given himself in the secret, silent chambers of his own mind. Kale. It meant slender, pure. A whisper of defiance in a world of numbers. The door hissed open, a sound so familiar it was part of his own breathing. He did not look up. Compliance demanded his gaze remain fixed on the point where the floor met the opposite wall. Footsteps echoed, 2 sets. One was the soft, synthetic slip of a technician's boots. The other was different, heavier, slower. Each step landed with a weight of authority that seemed to press the recycled air down, making it thick and heavy in his lungs. It was the sound of power, a sound Kale had been conditioned to recognize and submit to. Subject 734, a voice said. It was not the familiar, reedy tone of technician Aris. This voice was a low baritone, as cold and unyielding as polished stone. It held no inflection, no warmth, only a flat, resonant command. On your feet. Kale flowed upward, a single, fluid motion of trained obedience. He kept his eyes lowered, his gaze respectfully directed at the floor just in front of the new boots. They were black, immaculate, reflecting the sterile light in sharp, unforgiving lines. They were the boots of a commander, an alpha. The air, for the first time in memory, began to change. A subtle charge entered the void, a pressure against his skin. It was the barest hint of a presence, a scent so ruthlessly controlled it was almost undetectable. Yet to Kale's latent senses, it was a fissure in the sterile perfection of his world. Ozone and cold metal, like the air after a lightning strike. I am Commander Valerius, the voice continued, directly above him now. Your previous handler has been reassigned. I will be overseeing the final protocols for Project Chimera. Your protocols. Kyle gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He did not speak. Speaking was only for direct questions. His purpose was to listen, to absorb, to obey. The commander circled him slowly, his steps measured and silent. Kyle felt the man's gaze on him, a physical weight that traced the line of his neck, the curve of his shoulders, the slender shape of his form beneath the simple grey tunic. It was not the detached clinical assessment of the technicians. This was different. It was an evaluation of another kind, ancient and instinctual. A predator sizing up. What? Not prey. Something else. Something complex. Director Thorne believes your conditioning is complete, Valerius said, his voice closer now, just behind Cale's ear. Cale fought the urge to flinch. Proximity was a test. She believes you are a perfect instrument, docile and receptive. I am here to ensure that assessment is accurate. The success of the project depends on your absolute compliance. The commander came to a stop directly in front of him. Cale forced himself to remain still, a statue of submission. He could feel the heat radiating from the Alpha's body, a stark contrast to the room's regulated temperature. It was a living heat, a furnace of controlled power. Slowly, against every protocol he had ever known, Cale lifted his eyes. It was a mistake, a catastrophic, world-altering mistake. Commander Valerius was not what he had expected. He had imagined a brute, a man whose authority was written in harsh lines and physical intimidation. But the face before him was one of stark, severe beauty. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of a winter storm, grey and deep and turbulent. There was nothing in them, no anger, no pity, no interest. They were the eyes of the system itself, impersonal, absolute, and cold. But as Cale's gaze met his, something flickered in their depths. A spark, a glint of something ancient and predatory that was instantly suppressed, smothered under a glacier of discipline. For a single, breathless second, the commander's control wavered. Valerius's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along the hard line of it. His voice, when he spoke again, was even colder than before, clipped and precise. Let me be unequivocally clear. Subject 734. You are the most critical asset in this facility. Your genetic makeup, your latent pheromonal profile is irreplaceable. You are to be protected, monitored, and utilized. You are not to be engaged with. He took a half-step closer, the faint scent of ozone sharpening, cutting through the sterile air. Cale's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic wild bird in a cage of bone. You will have no physical contact. You will have no personal interaction. You are a component in a machine, nothing more. To me, to the technicians, to everyone in this spire, you are off limits. The words were blades, each one honed to sever any possibility of connection. They were a wall of ice erected between them. Cale heard them. He understood their meaning. He accepted them as his reality. He was an asset, an experiment, a thing. But the commander's eyes, his eyes said otherwise. As he spoke of clinical detachment, his pupils had dilated, just for a fraction of a second. As he uttered the words, off limits, his gaze had dropped to Cale's mouth, a fleeting ghost of a touch that Cale felt like a brand. The commander was a fortress of control, but Cale, in that one forbidden moment of eye contact, had seen a prisoner rattling the bars from within. The cold, empty voice spoke of protocol and function, but the storm-grey eyes spoke a different language entirely, a language of hunger, of conflict, of a terrifying, unwilling recognition. The air between them crackled with the lie. He had declared Cale a sterile component, but his very presence, his primal alpha nature, had already irrevocably contaminated the sterile room. And in that silent, dangerous contradiction, Cale felt the first true flicker of something that was not compliance. It was a terrifying, exhilarating seed of hope. The subsequent sessions were a study in control, a sterile ballet of command and obedience. Commander Valerius would enter the cell at the designated time, flanked by two technicians who moved with the silent efficiency of automatons. They would attach sensors to Kale's temples, his chest, his wrists, the cool metal discs, a familiar, impersonal touch against his skin. Kale would remain perfectly still, his breathing even, his heart rate, a steady, conditioned rhythm displayed in green lines on a floating hollow screen. Valerius never touched him. He would stand just outside the perimeter of the diagnostic field, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his storm-grey eyes fixed on the data streams. He observed, he analyzed, he dictated. Subjects' cortisol levels are nominal, he would state, his voice a flat monotone that betrayed no emotion. Proceed with the auditory stimulus. Phase 1. A series of discordant tones would fill the cell, designed to test neurological resilience. Kyle would sit through it, his expression placid, his body a monument to his conditioning. He had learned long ago to retreat inside himself, to find a quiet, empty space in his mind where the prodding and testing of the world could not reach him. But now, that quiet space was no longer empty. The commander's presence filled it, a low hum of energy that vibrated just beneath the surface of the clinical procedures. Kale could feel him, even with his eyes closed. He could feel the intensity of that gaze, a focused beam of attention that was far more invasive than any sensor. He began to study the alpha, not with his eyes, but with his other senses, the ones the spire had tried so hard to neutralize. He learned the subtle shift in the air when Valerius was tense, the almost imperceptible tightening of that ozone scent. He learned the rhythm of his breathing, the faint sound of the leather of his gloves creaking when he clenched his fists. These were not things the data screens could measure. They were the tells of the man behind the uniform, the cracks in the fortress of command. One cycle, during a neural mapping procedure, Kyle's body was required to be held in a state of absolute immobility by a light-based restraint field. He lay on the diagnostic plinth, his limbs held fast by shimmering blue energy. It was a standard procedure, one he had undergone hundreds of times. But this time, a stray energy fluctuation caused a minor arc, and a sharp, stinging pain shot up his arm. It was nothing, a mere pinprick, but his body reacted on instinct. A small, sharp gasp escaped his lips, his back arching infinitesimally against the restraints. On the hollow screen, his biometrics spiked, a flurry of red alerts. The technicians began chattering in clipped, anxious tones. Anomaly in Quadrant 7. Subject is experiencing unexpected pain stimuli. Before either technician could react, Valerius moved. He crossed the room in two long, silent strides, his authority a physical wave that pushed the technicians back. He stood over Kyle, his shadow falling across his face. Kyle's breath hitched, not from the lingering sting, but from the sudden, overwhelming proximity of the alpha. The scent of ozone and cold metal was overpowering now, clean and sharp and dangerously alluring. "Report," Valerius commanded, his eyes not on the panicked technicians, but locked on Kale's. "A minor surge in the restraint field, Commander. It stabilized. Subject's reaction was disproportionate to the stimulus." Valerius did not look away from Kale. The storm in his eyes was churning, a vortex of something Kale could not name. His hand lifted, gloved in black leather, and for a terrifying moment, Kale thought he was going to touch him, to check the site of the pain. The air crackled with unspoken tension. The technicians held their breath, Kale's heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm. Touch me. The thought was a silent scream in his mind, a primal betrayal of his every conditioned instinct. The commander's hand hovered in the air for a long, agonizing second, the space between his fingertips and Kyle's arm a universe of broken rules. Then, with a visible effort of will, his hand clenched into a fist and dropped back to his side. The mask of cold authority slammed back into place. Calibrate the field and continue the test, he ordered, his voice harsh, strained. He turned on his heel and strode back to his observation point, his posture rigid, his back a solid wall of denial. But Kale had seen it. He had felt it. In that moment, the commander had not seen Subject 734, a malfunctioning asset. He had seen an Omega in distress, and his instinct, his primal buried alpha instinct, had been to protect, to soothe, to claim. The lie of their clinical, detached relationship had been laid bare in that one aborted gesture. He had said Kale was off limits, but his body, his very soul, had screamed otherwise. After that, a new, dangerous game began. A silent war fought in the spaces between protocols. Kale started to test the boundaries, not with overt defiance, but with subtle, calculated gestures. During his nutrient cycle, he would let his gaze linger on the commander for a fraction of a second too long. When asked to perform a motor skills test, he would let his fingers brush the edge of the data pad Valerius was holding, a touch so light it could be dismissed as an accident. Each time, the reaction was the same. A tightening of the commander's jaw, a flicker in those grey eyes, a retreat. He would become colder, more distant, his orders more clipped. He was reinforcing the walls, making them higher, thicker. But Kale knew that the harder a man fought his own nature, the more violently it would one day break free. He was not just an asset, he was a catalyst, and he was beginning to understand that the purpose of Project Chimera might not be the only thing at stake in this sterile white room. His own liberation, and perhaps the commander's, was now part of the experiment. Valerius stood before the observation window of his private quarters, the sprawling, illuminated geometry of the spire laid out below him like a circuit board. The city knew no night, only regulated cycles of low and high luminescence. It was a perfect system, orderly, predictable, safe. It was everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed for. He pressed a gloved hand to the cold plasteel, the chill seeping through the leather, a familiar, grounding sensation. But it did little to cool the fire coiling in his gut, a heat that had been stoked to life the moment he had stepped into cell 734. He closed his eyes, and the image of the Omega swam in the darkness behind his lids. Slender, fragile-looking, with eyes the color of warm honey that held a terrifying, ancient wisdom. An impossible combination of utter compliance and a defiant spark of life that no amount of conditioning had managed to extinguish. When the Omega had looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time, Valerius had felt it like a physical blow, a jolt of recognition that bypassed his logic, his training, his very will. It was the call of his alpha nature, a primal, possessive roar he had spent his entire life suppressing, caging, and mastering. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, sliced through his thoughts. Rain, the smell of wet earth and blood, the sound of a woman screaming, her voice raw with terror and pain. He saw his father, a powerful, respected alpha, his eyes glazed over with the red haze of an uncontrolled rut, his authority forgotten, his humanity stripped away, leaving only the beast. He saw his mother, an Omega, beautiful and strong, cowering before the man she loved, her scent a spike of pure fear. He had been a boy, hiding, helpless, watching the chaos, the destruction, the moment his belief in the inherent goodness of his own designation had shattered. The system had failed them. Nature had betrayed them. That day Valerius had sworn an oath to himself. He would never be that beast. He would be control. He would be order. He would serve the Spire, the only thing that could protect them from themselves. Project Chimera was the culmination of that oath, a final, perfect solution. A way to chemically sever the violent, unpredictable link between instinct and action, to create a society free from the tyranny of ruts and heats, a world where alphas and omegas could coexist in placid, productive harmony. It was a noble goal, a necessary one, and Subject 734 was the key. His unique biology, the dormant, almost neutral state of his pheromones, held the potential for a universal suppressant. He was the cure for the sickness Valerius had witnessed as a child. So why did the sight of him feel like the disease itself? The Omega's scent. It was a ghost, a whisper. Most of the time it was nothing, as sterile as his cell. But in moments of stress, or when Valerius was close, a trace of it would bleed into the air. It was a scent unlike any he had ever encountered. Petrichor, the clean, earthy smell of rain on dry soil, and something else. Something floral and achingly sweet, like a flower that bloomed only in darkness. It was a scent of impossible contrasts, of longing and release, and it bypassed his suppressants and his discipline, sinking hooks directly into the most primitive part of his brain. It made the beast in him stir, press against its cage, and whisper promises of things he had long since renounced. He turned from the window, pacing the length of his sparse quarters. The restraint he had shown, the day of the energy arc, it had cost him. The effort to clench his fist, to pull his hand back from the Omega's skin, had felt like tearing muscle from bone. Every instinct had screamed at him to touch, to soothe, to shield, to place himself between the Omega and all harm, to leave his own scent on that pale skin, a declaration of protection, a claim. He was a commander of the Spire. He was the embodiment of its laws, and he was fantasizing about breaking every single one of them for a subject, an asset, an Omega who was strictly, absolutely off limits. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. He who championed control was losing his own. And the Omega. Kyle, he had heard a technician call him once, a slip of the tongue that had earned the man a severe reprimand. Kyle knew it. He could see it in the way the Omega watched him now, the subtle tests, the lingering glances, the accidental brushes of contact. He was not just a passive subject. He was intelligent, perceptive, and he was using Valerius's own fracturing control as a weapon, or perhaps not a weapon, a key. He was turning the lock from the inside, and Valerius was terrified of what would happen if the door finally swung open. A chime sounded, indicating an incoming priority message. He strode to his terminal, the image of Director Thorne shimmering into view. She was a woman who seemed carved from ice, her features sharp, her eyes a pale, penetrating blue. She was the architect of Project Chimera, and her belief in it was absolute. "Commander," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, "I have reviewed the data from today's session, the anomaly. It was a minor equipment malfunction, Director. It has been rectified." "The malfunction is not my concern," she corrected, her gaze unwavering. It is the subject's biometric response, and yours. Your heart rate accelerated by 12% in the 3 seconds you were in proximity to him. Your adrenaline levels spiked. Explain this. The system saw everything. Valerius kept his face a mask of neutrality. My response was appropriate for an officer moving to assess a potential threat to a high-value asset, Director. Thorn's thin lips curved into something that was not a smile. Of course. See that your assessments remain within protocol, Commander. The subject is entering a critical phase. His pheromonal latency is beginning to decay. Our projections indicate his first heat cycle could be triggered within the next 10 rotations. We must be ready. And you, Commander Valerius, must be impeccable. Do you understand? There is no room for sentiment. The word hung in the air between them, an accusation and a warning. I understand perfectly, Director, Valerius said, his voice like stone. Good, she replied, and her image dissolved, leaving him alone once more in the silent, sterile room. He stood motionless for a long time, the director's warning echoing in the quiet. His first heat. The thought sent a tremor through him, a jolt of pure, predatory alpha instinct that was so strong it made him physically sick. A first heat was a sacred, vulnerable time, a time for a bonded alpha to protect and cherish. The Spire intended to turn it into a clinical procedure, a harvest. They would use the Omega's pain and vulnerability to perfect their weapon of control. And he was the one tasked with overseeing it. He was meant to be the perfect, impartial instrument of their will. But the beast in his chest was roaring, and for the first time in his life, Valerius was afraid it was a roar of rebellion, not rage. The walls were closing in, and the perfect, orderly system he had dedicated his life to was beginning to feel like a cage of his own making. The power failure was not subtle. One moment, the cell was bathed in its usual shadowless, sterile light. The next, it was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The constant, low hum of the ventilation system died with a sickening whine, and for the first time in his life, Cale was surrounded by true silence. It was a terrifying, profound thing. The absence of the hum was a presence in itself, a heavy blanket that smothered everything. Emergency lights, thin red strips along the floor, flickered on a moment later, casting the room in a hellish, crimson glow. They illuminated very little, carving strange, dancing shadows out of the familiar shapes of the cot and the nutrient dispenser. Cale was on the diagnostic plinth, halfway through a synaptic stress test. Commander Valerius and a single senior technician, a stern-faced beta named Lin, were in the room with him. The light restraints had died with the power, freeing him instantly. He sat up, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The silence was broken by the technician's sharp, indrawn breath of panic and the commander's low curse. "Status, Lin." Valerius's voice cut through the darkness, sharp with command, but laced with an undercurrent of something else. Urgency. "Total grid failure in this sector, Commander. Life support is on emergency backup, but all monitoring and security systems are down. The door is sealed on magnetic lock. We're trapped until the grid resets." Lin's voice trembled, betraying her fear. The Spire was a machine, and its inhabitants were utterly dependent on it. A failure of this magnitude was unthinkable. Kyle remained on the plinth, his senses screaming. The sudden absence of the ventilation meant the air was no longer being scrubbed. It was becoming stagnant, thick with the technician's panicked beta scent of anxious sweat and the commander's tightly controlled ozone, which was now fraying at the edges, sharpening into something more potent, more alive, and his own scent. He could feel it, for the first time, unspooling from him like a ribbon of smoke in the still air. The faint, clean scent of rain and night-blooming flowers, amplified by his own fear. "Stay calm, technician," Valerius ordered. His silhouette moved in the red gloom, a large, dark shape against the faint light. He was moving towards the door, likely to check the manual override. Kale tracked the movement, his eyes wide in the darkness. Suddenly, a deep, shuddering groan echoed through the structure of the spire, a groan of stressed metal. The floor vibrated violently, knocking the technician off her feet with a cry of pain. Kale braced himself on the plinth as another, more powerful tremor hit. It felt as if the entire facility was tearing itself apart. "Structural integrity failure," Lynn gasped from the floor, her voice high with terror. "We have to get to a reinforced sector." Valerius abandoned the door. He turned, and in the dim, red light, his eyes found Kale's across the room. The clinical distance was gone. The commander was gone. In his place was an alpha, primal and focused, his gaze locked on the most vulnerable person in the room. Kyle saw the moment the choice was made. The instant instinct overrode protocol. With a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, Valerius crossed the room. He didn't stop at a respectful distance. He came right to the plinth, his presence a wall of heat and power that enveloped Kale completely. He reached down, not with hesitation this time, but with a swift, certain purpose. His hands, strong and warm even through the leather gloves, closed around Kale's upper arms. The contact was an explosion, a supernova of sensation in a life defined by its absence. Kale's breath caught in his throat, a strangled gasp. The feel of the commander's hands on him, firm, possessive, protective. It was overwhelming. His skin burned where they touched. A shiver racked his entire body, a response so primal and involuntary it terrified him. "Come," Valerius said, his voice a low growl, meant for Kyle's ears alone. He pulled Kyle from the plinth and pushed him gently but firmly towards the corner of the room, behind the heavy diagnostic console. "Get down. Stay behind me." It was a direct order, but it was not the command of an officer to a subordinate. It was the command of an alpha protecting his... Kyle's mind shied away from the word. He stumbled into the corner, pressing himself against the cold wall as Valerius moved to stand in front of him, creating a human shield. The alpha's scent was a storm in the small space now, ozone, and something deeper, muskier, a scent of pure, undiluted territorial aggression directed at the unseen threat to the building. And woven through it, Kale could smell his own scent blooming in response, petrica and jasmine, a pheromonal answer to the alpha's call of protection. Technician Lin was whimpering near the door. "My leg. I think it's broken." Valerius didn't turn. His focus was entirely on the potential for further collapse, his body a tense line of readiness. "Stay where you are, technician. Do not move." His voice was harsh, but it was the detached harshness of a commander assessing a crisis. The voice he had used with Kale, however, had been different, deeper, more personal. They waited in the terrifying, groaning silence of the dying machine, punctuated by the technician's soft cries of pain. Kyle was huddled behind Valerius, so close he could feel the heat from the alpha's back, could smell the fabric of his uniform, the leather of his gear. He was acutely aware of every shift of the man's weight, every tensing of his muscles. This was a proximity far more intimate than any of the clinical tests. In the darkness, stripped of their designated roles, they were just an alpha and an omega, caught in a moment of shared crisis. The off-limits rule had been rendered meaningless by the groaning of stressed plasteel and the threat of imminent death. Kale found himself reaching out, his fingers hesitating just inches from the commander's back. He wanted to touch him. He wanted to anchor himself to this solid, warm presence in the terrifying dark. It was a foolish, suicidal impulse, a betrayal of a lifetime of conditioning. But his body was no longer listening to his mind. His instincts, so long suppressed, were awake and screaming. He let his fingers brush against the rough fabric of the uniform. Valerius flinched as if struck by lightning. His entire body went rigid. He didn't turn, didn't speak, but Kyle felt the shudder that went through him. He felt the sharp, ragged intake of his breath. It was a tiny gesture, a whisper of a touch, but in the supercharged atmosphere of the darkened room, it was a confession, a surrender. The emergency power finally surged, and the main lights flickered back on, blindingly white and mercilessly bright. The hum of the ventilation returned, immediately beginning its work of scrubbing the air clean, of erasing the evidence of what had just happened. The moment was over. The spell was broken. Valerius stepped away from Kale as if burned, putting a careful, deliberate distance between them. He turned to deal with the injured technician, his voice once again the cold, efficient instrument of command. The mask was back in place, perfectly fitted, but Kyle had seen behind it. He had felt the man beneath the uniform. The world had returned to its sterile, orderly state, but something fundamental had been shattered in the darkness. The line had not just been crossed, it had been erased. And as rescue crews finally forced the door open, Kyle met the commander's gaze across the room. Valerius's eyes were bleak, his expression unreadable. But Kyle knew. They both knew. There was no going back. The Spire's official explanation for the event was a cascade failure in a minor power conduit, a 1 in a million anomaly. The structural groans were dismissed as sympathetic vibrations. Technician Lin was transferred to a medical facility with a fractured tibia, and the incident was classified, filed away, and forgotten by the system. But it was not forgotten by Kyle. It had become a part of him, a memory of touch and darkness that he replayed over and over in the silent hours. The feel of the commander's hands on his arms, the heat of his body, the raw, unfiltered scent of him. These sensations were now etched into his very being. They were a dangerous knowledge, a truth that contradicted the entire foundation of his existence. Valerius, for his part, became even more remote. He no longer entered the cell during routine diagnostics. He observed from a control booth, his face a detached, indistinct shape behind reinforced glass. His orders were relayed through a speaker, his voice tinny and distorted, stripped of its resonant power. He was enforcing the wall between them with plasteel and electronics, a desperate attempt to rebuild the protocol that had been shattered in the dark. But his absence was a presence, his silence a roar. Kale felt his gaze through the glass, a constant, burning pressure. The distance did not lessen the tension. It amplified it, stretching it taut like a wire about to snap. Kale knew he had to understand. He needed to know what Project Chimera truly was. The word suppressant had been used, but the scale of it, the true purpose, remained shrouded in clinical jargon. He began to watch, to listen, with a new, desperate focus. He observed the technicians, their conversations just outside his cell door, the way they handled the data chips containing his results. He became a ghost, a silent observer in his own life, gleaning scraps of information. The opportunity came unexpectedly. A new, junior technician, clumsy and nervous, was tasked with running a biodata upload from within the cell. The procedure required him to interface his datapad directly with the port beside Kyle's cot. The technician was sweating, his hands fumbling. He was clearly intimidated by the proximity to a high-value asset. As he worked, he left his datapad unattended on the cot for a mere 10 seconds, while he turned to recalibrate a sensor on the wall. 10 seconds was an eternity. With movements that were economical and swift, born of years of observing and waiting, Kale leaned forward. His fingers flew across the smooth surface of the datapad. He did not have the clearance codes, but he knew the system's architecture from a deep, intuitive understanding forged from a lifetime inside it. He didn't try to access the main files. He accessed the cache, the temporary data. The recently viewed documents often held fragments, echoes of the truth. His eyes scanned the screen, his mind absorbing the information with breathtaking speed. He saw diagrams of the molecular structure of his own pheromones. He saw theoretical models of dispersal systems. And then he saw the project's mission statement, a document Valerius had clearly reviewed just before entering the control booth. It was not a suppressant. That was a euphemism. It was an eradicator. Project Chimera, the development of a bioaerosol agent derived from the unique pheromonal markers of Subject 734 during his initial heat cycle. The agent, designated PAX, will permanently neutralize the limbic responses in all alpha and omega designations. It will sever the instinctual drive for mating, bonding, and territoriality, resulting in a docile, emotionally regulated populace, free from the biological imperatives that lead to social instability. The words were cold, clinical, and utterly monstrous. They were not trying to control instinct. They were trying to annihilate it, to lobotomize an entire society on a genetic level, to create a world of compliant, placid sheep, their spirits gelded, their deepest connections rendered impossible. And he, Kyle, was the source. His body, his nature, his most vulnerable biological moment, was to be weaponized to enslave everyone like him. He was not the key to a cure. He was the genesis of a plague. The technician turned back, snatching the datapad with a nervous apology. He hadn't seen. Kyle leaned back, his posture once again one of perfect compliance. But inside, his world was a maelstrom of ice and fire. The sterile cell, once a sanctuary of sorts, was now a laboratory where his soul was being dissected. The people who controlled his life were not just scientists. They were monsters, cloaked in the righteous language of order and safety. And Valerius, the commander, he knew. He had always known. His conflict, his turmoil, the fight he was waging against his own nature. It was not just about a forbidden attraction to an Omega. It was a crisis of conscience. He was a man tasked with midwifery to a monstrosity, and it was tearing him apart. The knowledge was a shard of ice in Kale's heart. The tentative trust, the flicker of hope he had felt in the darkness, curdled into a cold, profound sense of betrayal. The commander's struggle was not for Kale's sake. It was for his own. He was not a potential savior. He was a conflicted jailer, wrestling with the morality of the lock he was paid to keep fastened. The next time Valerius's distorted voice came over the speaker, Kale did not react with the usual subtle signs of attention, he remained utterly still, his eyes fixed on the blank wall opposite him. Subject 734, acknowledge the instruction. Begin the respiratory control exercise. Silence. Kyle did not move. He did not breathe. He simply existed, a silent, unmoving protest. Subject 734, I repeat, acknowledge the instruction. The voice was sharper now, laced with static and impatience. Kyle slowly, deliberately, turned his head and looked towards the observation window. He could not see the commander's face clearly, only a dark outline against the light of the control booth. He knew Valerius could see him perfectly. He met the unseen gaze of the man who knew the truth of his fate, the man who was complicit in it. He did not need to speak. His eyes, the honey-colored eyes that had so unnerved the commander from the very beginning, asked the question for him. How could you? He saw the silhouette behind the glass flinch, a sharp, jerky movement. The speaker crackled and then went silent. For a full minute, there was no sound, no order. There was only the silent, damning accusation hanging in the air between the cell and the control booth. When Valerius finally spoke again, his voice was not relayed through the speaker. He had activated the private comm channel, a direct, unfiltered link. His real voice, low and strained, filled Kyle's ear through a hidden receiver. Kyle, he said. It was the first time he had used the name. It was a desperate, broken sound, an admission of guilt, a plea. But for Kyle, it was too late. The betrayal was too absolute. The man who had shielded him in the dark was the same man who was leading him to a slaughter of the soul. The wall between them was no longer made of protocol. It was made of this monstrous, unforgivable truth. And Kyle knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his heat was coming. And with it, the end of everything. The aftermath of the revelation was a silent, suffocating war. Kyle's compliance became a weapon. He performed every task, every test, with a chilling, robotic perfection that was a mockery of the docile instrument they wanted him to be. He was a mirror, reflecting the cold, mechanical nature of their project back at them. His silence was an accusation. His obedience was a condemnation. He ate the nutrient paste, he submitted to the sensors, he walked the prescribed number of steps in his cell, and with every action he screamed his defiance in a way only one person could hear. Through the observation glass, Valerius watched, and Kyle could feel the man's control disintegrating day by day. The commander's posture grew rigid, his presence in the control booth a study in torment. He would stand for hours, unmoving, his gaze fixed on Kyle, and Kyle would refuse to look back, denying him even the smallest connection. The private comm was never used again. The chasm of Kyle's betrayal was too wide to be crossed with a single whispered name. Valerius was trapped. Kyle understood it now with a terrible clarity. The commander was a true believer whose faith had been poisoned. He had built his life on the altar of the Spire's ideology. That order, achieved at any cost, was preferable to the chaos of nature. He had seen the beast, and he had devoted his life to caging it, both in the world and within himself. Project Chimera was his salvation, the ultimate cage. But now he had seen the face of the sacrifice required. He had looked into the eyes of the lamb, and he had found not a mindless asset, but a person, a soul. And the system he served was demanding he sanction its destruction. The change in Kyle's physiology began subtly, a low, persistent ache in his bones, a strange sensitivity to light and sound, a feverish heat that bloomed under his skin at odd hours, making him feel flushed and weak. The technicians noted the changes with a detached, scientific excitement. Premonitory symptoms, their reports read. Subject is progressing as projected. They increased his nutrient supplements and began monitoring him around the clock. The final phase was approaching. Kyle felt a terrifying duality. His body was betraying him, marching inexorably towards the heat that would signal his end, the moment he would be harvested. Yet at the same time, his senses were sharpening, his instincts coming alive in a way they never had before. The world, once a muted, sterile landscape, was starting to gain texture. He could smell the faint, metallic tang of the technician's fear, the sour scent of the nutrient paste before it even arrived. And he could smell Valerius. Even from the control booth, separated by glass and filtered air, he could sometimes catch a ghost of ozone and musk, a scent his body now instinctively craved, and his mind reviled. One cycle, as he lay on his cot, a wave of heat so intense it made him gasp, washed over him. His back arched, a low whimper escaping his lips against his will. His skin felt too tight, his blood like lava in his veins. A sweet, cloying scent filled the air, the first true herald of his heat. It was overwhelming, a thick, desperate perfume of petrichor and jasmine, a plea and a demand all in one. In the control booth, he saw Valerius jolt as if he'd been shot. The commander slammed his hand against a console, and a heavy shield descended over the observation window, plunging the booth into darkness from Kyle's perspective. But it was too late. The scent was in the ventilation system. It was a contagion, a truth that could no longer be contained. Valerius tore himself away from the control booth, stumbling down the sterile white corridor like a wounded man. Kale's scent was everywhere. It clung to the recycled air, a sweet, agonizing poison that bypassed every filter, every chemical suppressant he had taken that morning. It was the scent of pure, undiluted Omega, a siren call to every alpha instinct he possessed. It spoke of vulnerability, of need, of a perfect, fated compatibility that his mind screamed to deny. It was the scent of the trap closing around him. He slammed his fist into the corridor wall, the impact echoing in the silent hall. Pain shot up his arm, a welcome, grounding sensation in the storm of his unraveling control. He had to report to Director Thorne. He had to inform her that the subject was entering the initial stages of the cycle. He had to set the machine in motion, the harvest, the creation of Pax. He thought of the Omega's eyes, the way they had looked at him after learning the truth. They were not angry. They were not hateful. They were filled with a profound, shattering disappointment. It was an accusation of a deeper crime than mere cruelty, a betrayal of a shared potential, a connection that had sparked in the dark and had been forsaken in the light. How could you? He had no answer. Because he served the greater good. Because it prevented the chaos that had destroyed his family. Because one life was a small price to pay for a world of peace. The justifications ran through his head, the litany he had recited for years. But they were hollow now, dead words. They offered no defense against the memory of a feather-light touch on his back in a dark, shaking room. They offered no comfort against the sweet, desperate scent that was now hijacking his very soul. He forced himself to his private quarters and keyed in the director's channel. Her icy face appeared. "Commander, you are not at your post." "Director," he said, his voice a raw rasp. The subject, the cycle has begun. A flicker of triumph lit her pale eyes. Excellent. Ahead of schedule. Is the primary containment lab prepared? It is. And the extraction team? On standby. Then initiate the protocol, Commander, she ordered, her voice crisp. We will induce the full heat cycle within the hour. I want him moved to the lab immediately. This is the moment we have worked for, Valerius, the culmination of your own ideals. You should be proud. He looked at her face, at the cold, clinical certainty, and for the first time he saw not a savior, but a zealot, a monster who would burn the world to create her sterile paradise, and he was her most trusted soldier. The comm link closed, leaving him with her final order hanging in the air, like a death sentence. Induce the heat, move him to the lab, harvest him. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a boy named Kale, who had never seen the sun, and whose only crime was to be born what he was. Valerius looked at his own hands, the hands that had shielded that boy in the dark, and knew that they were now ordered to deliver him to his vivisection. The beast inside him, the one he had feared and caged his entire life, was stirring. But it was not with the red haze of rut, not with the mindless violence he so despised. It was stirring with a righteous, protective fury that was clearer and more pure than any ideology. It was the fury of an alpha whose omega was threatened. He had a choice. He could follow his orders, uphold his duty, and become the monster he was pretending not to be. Or he could break his oath, betray his entire world, and honor the silent promise he had made in the dark. The choice was no choice at all. He had made it the moment Kyle had touched his back. He had only been lying to himself ever since. Turning on his heel, he strode not towards the containment lab, but towards the sector armory. The time for control was over. The time for chaos had come. The world dissolved into a fever dream of pain and want. They came for him in white suits, their faces obscured by reflective masks, their scents chemically neutralized. They were ghosts. They strapped him to a gurney, and he was too weak to fight, his body consumed by the fire in his blood. A sharp prick in his neck, and the fire became an inferno. The induction agent. They were forcing it, accelerating the cycle. A scream tore from his throat, raw and animalistic, a sound he didn't recognize as his own. The scent pouring from him was no longer a sweet perfume. It was a shriek, a desperate, cloying fog of pure need and terror. He was wheeled through the sterile corridors he had only ever seen on monitors. The white lights blurred into streaks, the sounds of the spire smearing into a meaningless drone beneath the roaring in his ears. His body was not his own. It was a vessel of primal, agonizing instinct. It arched and strained against the restraints, seeking a pressure, a presence, a relief that was not there. It cried out for an alpha, for Valerius. The name was a brand on his soul, a simultaneous beacon of hope and a curse of betrayal. They brought him to a room that was colder than his cell, a circular chamber made of glass and steel, the primary containment lab. He was transferred to a central plinth, his wrists and ankles locked into cold metal cuffs. Scientists moved around the perimeter of the glass, their faces impassive, their voices a low murmur, as they monitored the data streaming from the sensors attached to his trembling body. He was an exhibit, a specimen under a microscope, his most vulnerable, intimate moments displayed for their cold, analytical eyes. Humiliation was a fresh wave of agony on top of the physical torment. He could see into the main control room through the glass wall. Director Thorne was there, a pale statue of triumph. And beside her, stood Commander Valerius. Kale's heart, already hammering, seemed to shatter in his chest. He had come. He was here. To watch, to oversee the harvest. The final, ultimate betrayal. Kale met his eyes across the sterile space, and the last flicker of hope within him died, turning to ash. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a hot path through the grime on his temple. He would not give them the satisfaction of watching him beg. Valerius stood beside the director, his face a mask of stone, his body rigid in his dress uniform. He felt nothing. He had walled off his emotions, packed them in ice to get through this, to play his part. He could feel Kale's gaze on him, a physical blow, an indictment that struck him deeper than any weapon. He did not let himself react. He kept his eyes on the biometric readouts, his voice level and cold as he confirmed the data points for the director. Pheromone levels are peaking, director. The subject's body is producing the target compounds. Excellent, Thorne breathed, her eyes gleaming. Begin the primary extraction sequence. I want to capture the apex of the cycle. Yes, director. Valerius turned to the console, his movements precise, robotic. He keyed in the authorization codes. A series of articulated metal arms, tipped with gleaming needles, descended from the ceiling of the glass chamber, moving with silent, terrifying grace towards Kyle's prone form. Kyle's eyes flew open. He saw the needles, and a fresh wave of terror cut through the haze of his heat. He began to struggle in earnest, pulling against the restraints, his movements frantic, desperate. A choked, pleading sound escaped his lips. No. Please. And that was the sound that broke the world. That soft, desperate plea shattered the ice around Valerius's heart. It bypassed the commander, the soldier, the ideologue, and struck the alpha at his very core. He saw not a subject, but Kyle. His Kyle. Pinned, terrified, and about to be violated in the most profound way imaginable. The beast he had caged for so long did not roar. It erupted. With a snarl that was purely inhuman, Valerius spun from the console. In one fluid, violent motion, he drew the service pistol from his hip and fired. Not at the director, not at the guards. He fired at the console that controlled the extraction arms. The screen exploded in a shower of sparks and fractured light. Alarms blared, ear-splitting and frantic. Red lights began to strobe through the facility, painting the scene in blood and shadow. Director Thorne stared at him, her expression of triumph frozen into one of utter disbelief. Valerius, what have you done? What I should have done from the beginning, he growled, his voice a low, guttural sound he barely recognized. He turned the gun on the two guards who were moving towards him. Stay back. They hesitated, shocked by the commander's sudden, violent betrayal. That hesitation was all he needed. He slammed his fist into the emergency release panel for the containment chamber. It was a fail-safe, designed to be used only in case of catastrophic system failure, and it required the highest level of command clearance. His clearance. With a hiss of depressurizing gas, the glass wall of the chamber slid away. The full, undiluted force of Kale's scent hit Valerius like a physical wall. It was a tsunami of need, pain, and longing that overloaded his senses and obliterated the last vestiges of his control. His alpha instincts surged, a possessive, protective rage that demanded action. He strode into the chamber, ignoring the shocked scientists and the blaring alarms. His world had shrunk to one single point, the Omega on the plinth. Kale stared at him, his honey-colored eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning, incredulous hope. He was still pulling at his restraints, whimpering softly. Valerius reached the plinth and, with a furious roar, he grabbed the metal cuff on Kale's wrist and tore it from its mooring. The metal screamed and bent under the sheer, adrenaline-fueled force of his rage. He ripped the other 3 restraints free in quick succession, his movements brutally efficient. He gathered Kale's trembling, feverish body into his arms. Kale collapsed against him, boneless and sobbing, burying his face in the crook of the commander's neck, inhaling his scent as if it were air. The contact was explosive for both of them. For Kale, it was the safety and relief his body had been screaming for. For Valerius, it was a brand, a claim, a final, irrevocable declaration. He wrapped one arm securely around Kale's back, holding him close, while his other hand kept the pistol aimed at the control room. "No one follows," he snarled, his eyes now the color of a raging thundercloud, promising death to anyone who tried. He backed out of the lab, shielding Kale's body with his own. The spire was in chaos. Alarms echoed from every direction. Doors were slamming shut as the facility went into lockdown. He had just declared war on the only world he had ever known. He was a traitor, a fugitive. He had thrown away his life, his career, his entire belief system. He looked down at the Omega in his arms, who was clinging to him, shaking but quiet now, calmed by his proximity. Kale looked up at him, his eyes luminous with tears and a fragile, terrifying trust. In that moment, holding the person he had been tasked to destroy, Valerius felt a sense of purpose so profound and absolute it eclipsed everything he had ever believed. He was no longer a commander. He was no longer a cog in the machine. He was just an alpha, and he would burn the world to the ground to keep his Omega safe. The escape was a blur of violence and adrenaline. Valerius moved through the corridors of the spire with the deadly efficiency of a man who knew its every secret, its every weakness. He had designed its security protocols. He knew how to break them. Kale was a feverish weight in his arms, his consciousness flickering, his body pliant and trusting. He clung to Valerius, his face pressed against the commander's neck, his senses overwhelmed by the alpha's scent of ozone and protective rage. It was an anchor in the storm of his heat, the only thing keeping him from shattering completely. They moved downwards, away from the pristine upper levels of command and into the guts of the machine. The corridors here were no longer white and seamless, but were a tangled mess of conduits, pipes, and maintenance tunnels. The air was thick with the smell of lubricant and hot metal. The alarms were more distant here, the lockdown procedures less absolute. Valerius knew of a service hatch, an old, forgotten exit that led to the underlevels, the foundations of the spire that bordered the wastes outside. It was their only chance. He found the hatch behind a corroded maintenance panel, its existence wiped from all but the oldest schematics. It took his full strength to wrench it open, the rusted metal groaning in protest. Beyond it was darkness, and the first breath of unprocessed air Kyle had ever smelled. It was cold, damp, and thick with the scent of decay and wet stone. It was the most wonderful thing he had ever experienced. Valerius lowered them into the tunnel, pulling the heavy hatch closed above them. They were plunged into near-total darkness, the only sound, the dripping of water and Kale's ragged breaths against his neck. He didn't stop. He moved with a sure-footedness that bespoke long familiarity, one arm still holding Kyle securely, the other hand holding his pistol, sweeping the darkness ahead of them. "Where?" Kyle managed to whisper, his voice hoarse. "A place they won't think to look," Valerius answered, his voice a low rumble. "An old geothermal vent station. It's abandoned, but it will be warm and safe." The journey felt endless. The tunnel twisted and turned, sloping ever downwards. Kale's heat was a relentless tide, pulling him under. Waves of cramping and a deep, aching need pulsed through him. He whimpered, pressing himself closer to the solid heat of the Alpha's body. Valerius's hold tightened, a silent reassurance. His control was fraying. Kale could smell it. The Alpha's scent was thick with a barely restrained possessiveness, a muskiness that spoke of his own struggle against the instincts Kyle's condition was provoking. But his strength, his focus, never wavered. He was a pillar of resolve in the encroaching chaos. Finally, a faint orange glow appeared ahead. The air grew warmer, thick with the smell of sulfur and steam. They emerged from the tunnel into a vast, cavernous space. A massive, dormant geothermal turbine dominated the center of the chamber, its metal surfaces coated in rust and mineral deposits. Pipes, thick as a man's waist, snaked across the floor and walls, glowing faintly in places where the internal heat was still intense. It was a dead place, a forgotten cog in the spire's great machine, and it was the safest place in the world. Valerius gently set Kale down on a pile of discarded insulation canvas in a sheltered alcove, the material rough but clean. Kyle immediately curled into a ball, his body trembling violently as another wave of his heat washed over him. The need was a physical claw, scraping him hollow from the inside. He cried out, a low, miserable sound. Valerius watched him, his face a mask of anguish. His duty, his instinct, his entire being was screaming at him to give the Omega what he needed, to bond him, to claim him and end his suffering. But he couldn't. To do so now, when Kale was not in his right mind, when he was vulnerable and terrified, would be a violation. It would be no better than what Thorn had wanted to do, just with a different purpose. It would make him the beast he so feared. He stripped off his heavy uniform jacket and draped it over Kyle. The fabric was saturated with his scent, a heavy, comforting weight. Kyle immediately latched onto it, pulling it close, burying his face in the material and inhaling deeply. His trembling subsided slightly. It was a poor substitute for the real thing, but it was something. Valerius then began to build a nest. He gathered more of the discarded canvas, scavenged old uniform scraps from forgotten lockers, tearing them into soft strips. He worked with a single-minded, frantic energy, his movements driven by an instinct he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. He built a small, defensible circle of soft materials around Kale, a barrier against the cold stone and the hostile world. When it was done, he knelt at the edge of it, his posture that of a sentry, his face grim. Valerius. Kale whimpered from the depths of the nest, his eyes hazy with fever. It hurts. I know, Valerius said, his voice thick with pain. I know, Kyle. I'm here. I will not leave you. You are safe. He spent the next cycle, he had no idea of how long it truly was, tending to the Omega. He found a leaking pipe with clean condensed water and let Kyle sip it from his cupped hands. He sat by the nest, a silent guardian, fighting a brutal war within himself. Every pained whimper from Kyle was a physical blow. Every wave of that sweet, desperate scent was a temptation that scraped his soul raw. He wanted to crawl into that nest, to surround the Omega with his body, to offer the comfort and release they both so desperately craved. But he held himself back, his knuckles white as he gripped his pistol, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He would protect Kyle, even from himself. Slowly, agonizingly, the peak of the heat began to pass. Kyle's fever broke, and the frantic, desperate edge to his scent softened into a low, smoldering ember. He fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. Valerius watched him, the lines of tension on his face slowly easing. He had done it. They had survived. He finally allowed himself to sit, his back against a warm pipe, his entire body screaming with exhaustion. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the cold, hard reality of their situation. They were fugitives. The Spire would be hunting them. Director Thorne would not forgive his betrayal. She would tear the Spire apart to find them, to reclaim her project, and punish her traitorous commander. He looked at Kale, sleeping peacefully in the nest made of rags and a commander's jacket. His face, in repose, was heartbreakingly young. A lifetime spent in a sterile box had not managed to erase the soft curve of his cheek, the gentle sweep of his lashes against his skin. A fierce, protective tenderness swelled in Valerius's chest, so powerful it stole his breath. He had thought Project Chimera was the answer. He had believed that severing instinct was the path to peace. How wrong he had been. Instinct was not just the mindless violence of the rut. It was this overwhelming, all-consuming need to protect, to cherish, to put another's life before your own. It was not a cage. It was the key. He had betrayed his world, but he had saved his soul. The future was a terrifying unknown, a dark tunnel with no light at the end. But for the first time in his life, Valerius was not afraid of the chaos. He reached out, his hand hesitating for only a moment before his fingers gently brushed a stray lock of hair from Kyle's forehead. The contact was soft, reverent. It was not the touch of a commander to an asset. It was not born of instinct or of need. It was a choice, a promise. The off-limits barrier, once a rule of law, had been broken by necessity. Now, in the quiet dark, it was being dismantled by something far more powerful. A fragile, terrifying, and undeniable love. Kale woke slowly, drifting up from a deep, dreamless sleep. The first thing he noticed was the silence. It was different from the manufactured silence of his cell. This was a living quiet, punctuated by the soft drip of water and a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the very stones around him. The second thing he noticed was the scent. It was Valerius, the rich grounding scent of ozone and alpha musk, no longer sharp with rage or conflict, but settled, calm, and deeply protective. It was woven into the fabric he was clutching, a heavy jacket that smelled more of the man than the man himself. He opened his eyes. He was in a nest, a soft, warm hollow of canvas and cloth that cradled him completely. And sitting just outside its edge, his back against a massive, warm pipe, was the commander. He was asleep, his head slumped to his chest, the pistol resting loosely in his lap. The harsh lines of his face were softened in slumber, the mask of command erased, leaving behind a man who looked weary, vulnerable, and achingly human. Kyle's heart constricted with an emotion so powerful it felt like pain. The memories of his heat were a hazy, feverish blur, but moments of clarity pierced through. The terror of the lab, the gleaming needles, and then Valerius, the explosion of the console, the feeling of being lifted, held, protected. The flight through the dark tunnels, the gentle hands that gave him water, the low, soothing voice that promised he was safe. He had not imagined it. It was real. This man, his jailer, his conflicted tormentor, had thrown everything away for him. Carefully, so as not to wake him, Kyle sat up. His body was sore and weak, but the fire in his blood was gone, replaced by a gentle, languid warmth. He was his own again. He looked down at himself, wrapped in the commander's jacket, nestled in a bed Valerius had made for him. This raw, instinctual act of care was more intimate than any physical union. Valerius had not taken advantage of his vulnerability. He had guarded it. He had protected Kyle's honor, even at the cost of his own sanity. The word came to him then, unbidden and absolute. Mine. The thought was not possessive in the way of the spire, which saw him as an asset to be owned. It was a simple, profound recognition of a bond forged in darkness and rebellion. He was Valerius's, and Valerius was his. Valerius stirred, his senses instantly coming online. His eyes snapped open, and for a second, they were the hard, alert eyes of a soldier. Then they focused on Kale, and they softened. The storm in them was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet concern. Kale, he said, his voice rough with sleep. You're awake. How do you feel? Weak, Kyle admitted, his own voice soft. But clear. It's over. Valerius nodded, a visible wave of relief washing over him. He started to get up, to put distance between them, to re-establish some semblance of their old dynamic. But Kyle spoke first. Don't, he whispered. Please, stay. The commander froze. Kyle held his gaze, trying to pour all of his gratitude, all of his dawning affection into that single look. He shifted, making a space in the nest beside him. It was an invitation, a question. For a long, silent moment, Valerius was motionless, a statue of conflict. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of a final surrender, he moved. He didn't just sit at the edge. He eased himself into the nest, his large frame filling the space, his warmth a solid, comforting presence. He sat beside Kale, not touching, but the proximity was a universe of intimacy. They will be hunting us, Valerius said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the dark tunnel from which they had come. Thorn will not let this go. She'll see it as a personal failure, a flaw in her perfect system that must be purged. Why did you do it? Kyle asked, the question he had been holding in his heart. You believe in the spire, in its order. Valerius was silent for a long time, the only sound the gentle hum of the geothermal pipes. Finally, he turned to look at Kale, his grey eyes holding a deep, ancient sadness. I saw my father in her, he said softly. In Director Thorn. He was consumed by his own nature, and he destroyed my family. She is consumed by her fear of that same nature, and she is willing to destroy the world to control it. They are two sides of the same coin. I spent my life running from one, only to end up serving the other. He shook his head, a gesture of profound self-recrimination. The spire doesn't create order. It creates a vacuum. It starves people of connection, of instinct, of love, and calls the emptiness peace. That's not order. It's just a slower kind of death. His confession was a gift, a bearing of his soul. Kale felt a profound empathy for the boy who had watched his world collapse and the man who had tried to build a new one out of its ashes. You didn't create a vacuum, Kale said, his voice gaining strength. In that room, in the dark, you created a safe place. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and laid it on Valerius's arm. The muscles beneath the fabric were tense, hard as stone. At his touch, Valerius flinched, but he didn't pull away. Kale left his hand there, a silent statement. I choose this. I see you. Kyle, Valerius breathed, his voice ragged. You don't know what you are doing. I am not a safe person for you to be around. What I feel, my instincts. I know what you are, Kyle interrupted gently. You're the man who built me a nest when your body was screaming to claim me. You're the man who gave me your jacket when you had nothing else. You are the man who respected me when I was not myself. He moved closer, the warmth of his body pressing against the alpha's side. Your instincts didn't make you a beast, Valerius. They made you a man. Valerius finally turned his head fully, his face just inches from Kale's. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the scent of their mingled pheromones, ozone and rain, a storm and its aftermath, and with the terrifying, beautiful possibility of what came next. The off-limits rule was a ghost, a memory of a life that no longer existed. In its place was a choice, freely offered and freely received. Valerius lifted a hand, his fingers tracing the line of Kyle's jaw with a touch so gentle it was almost reverent. His thumb brushed across Kyle's lower lip. I will not hurt you, he vowed, his voice a raw whisper. It was not a promise of future safety from the spire. It was a sacred, personal oath. I know, Kyle whispered back. And then, slowly, with all the time in the world, Valerius leaned in and closed the final distance between them. The kiss was not one of passion or of desperate need. It was soft, hesitant, a question and an answer all in one. It was a taste of freedom, of a future that was terrifyingly uncertain, but for the first time, entirely their own. In the heart of the dying machine, surrounded by darkness and decay, two of its prisoners had found not just an escape, but a beginning. Their sanctuary in the geothermal station was a fragile bubble of time, a stolen breath between a past that was ashes and a future that was a hunt. They existed in a timeless cycle of sleep, hushed conversations, and a slowly blossoming intimacy. Valerius, the former commander, became a caretaker and a strategist. He scavenged what he could from the abandoned levels, medkits with nearly expired analgesics, forgotten ration packs, discarded power cells to rig a small, dim light. Kale, whose body was slowly recovering from the ordeal of his heat, watched him, his admiration growing with every small act of survival. He was seeing the man who had been buried beneath the uniform, a man of immense capability, fierce intelligence, and a deep, guarded tenderness. They talked. For the first time, they truly talked. Kale spoke of his life in the cell, a world of white walls and silent obedience, and of the secret name he had given himself. Valerius, in turn, spoke more of his past, of the shadow his father's fall had cast over his entire life, and of his gradual, horrifying realization that the spire's cure was worse than the disease. They were two broken pieces of the same brutal system, finding solace in each other's fractured edges. The physical intimacy between them was a slow, gentle discovery. It began with small touches, a hand on an arm, fingers brushing as a ration pack was exchanged. After their first kiss, there were others, each one a deeper exploration, a more certain affirmation of the bond between them. They would lie together in the nest, not in the throes of passion, but simply holding each other, drawing strength and warmth from their proximity. For Kale, who had never known gentle, consensual touch, it was a revelation. It was a language his body had always known, but had never been allowed to speak. For Valerius, who had equated physical contact with a loss of control, it was a healing. To touch Kyle, to hold him, and feel only a deep, protective love rather than the red haze of instinct, was to reclaim a part of himself he thought he had lost forever. One cycle, as they shared a bland but welcome ration bar, Kale looked at the alpha. "You called me by my name," he said quietly. "In the cell. Before everything. How did you know it?" Valerius paused, his expression unreadable for a moment. "I was reviewing your file," he admitted, his voice low. "The deep psychological profiles, the conditioning reports. Most of it was clinical data, but one junior psych tech had made a strange notation in the margins. He had been monitoring your dream states. He wrote that in your REM cycles, you often whispered a single word. Kyle. The official report dismissed it as a meaningless vocalization, but I knew it wasn't." He met the Omega's eyes. "I knew it was your name, the one you had kept for yourself, the only thing they hadn't been able to take from you." Kale felt a lump form in his throat. Valerius had not just seen a disobedient subject. He had seen a person holding on to the last shred of his identity, and he had recognized it. He had honored it. "They will have sealed the lower levels by now," Valerius said, his voice shifting back to the pragmatic tone of a soldier. "And they will be sweeping sector by sector. They know I'm an expert in their protocols. Thorn will assume I'm using their own system against them. She will be methodical. We can't stay here forever." "Is there anywhere to go?" Kyle asked, the fear a cold knot in his stomach. The spire was all he had ever known. The idea of a world outside it was an abstraction, as terrifying as it was alluring. "There are stories," Valerius said, his gaze distant. "Among the lower-level maintenance crews and the grunts in the enforcers, stories of settlements in the wastes, freeholds, places where people who couldn't or wouldn't fit into the spire's system went to survive. They're considered myths by high command, propaganda, but I have a feeling the myths are true." He looked at Kale, his expression firming with resolve. "We have to get out, not just out of this station, out of the spire entirely." The plan was desperate. Their only way out was up. Not back into the main levels, but through the primary exhaust vent that serviced the geothermal station. It was a massive, vertical shaft that led all the way to the spire's upper atmosphere exchangers. It was rarely used, almost never inspected, but it was a sheer 1,000-meter climb through a tube of darkness and grime. They spent 2 more cycles preparing, rationing their food, salvaging anything that could be used as a tool. Valerius fashioned a crude harness for Kale from belts and canvas, and another for himself. He found a length of heavy power cable that would serve as their safety line. It was a suicidal plan, but it was their only one. The night they left, a strange quiet fell between them. They stood at the base of the massive vent, a sheer wall of metal that disappeared into the oppressive darkness above. The updraft was a constant, cool sigh, carrying the faint chemical tang of the world above. "Are you ready?" Valerius asked, his voice echoing slightly in the vast shaft. Kale nodded, his heart hammering. He was terrified, but as he looked at Valerius, at the strong, determined set of his jaw, the fear was overshadowed by a profound sense of trust. He had spent his life as a prisoner, alone. Now, he was facing the terrifying unknown, but he was not alone. Valerius checked the harness on Kyle one last time, his hands lingering on his waist. He leaned in, his forehead resting against Kale's. "I will not let you fall," he murmured, his breath warm. "I know," Kyle said, and he meant it. The climb was a brutal, vertical hell. They moved in silence, their world reduced to the rough, greasy surface of the maintenance ladder, the strain in their muscles, and the sound of their own labored breathing. Valerius went first, a dark shape above, his reassuring presence the only thing keeping Kale from looking down into the terrifying, absolute blackness below. Hours bled into each other. Their muscles screamed. Their hands were raw, but they kept going, meter by painstaking meter. Finally, after an eternity of climbing, Valerius stopped. "We're here," he gasped. A faint grey light filtered from a grate far above them. It was the top. With the last of his strength, Valerius forced the heavy grate open. The air that washed over them was shockingly cold and clean. It smelled of nothing Kale recognized, no sterile filters, no hot metal, no decay. It smelled alive. Valerius hauled himself out, then reached down and pulled Kale up after him. They collapsed onto a metal walkway, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. They were on the outer skin of the spire, on a maintenance platform hundreds of stories above the ground, and before them was the sky. Kyle had only ever seen it on monitors, a perfect, simulated blue. This was real. It was a bruised, pre-dawn purple, streaked with clouds of rose and gold, and in it, hanging like diamonds on dark velvet, were the last of the morning stars. It was vast, infinite, and so achingly beautiful that it brought tears to his eyes. He had spent his life in a box, and he had never imagined the sheer scale of freedom. He turned to Valerius, his face wet with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. The rising sun caught the Alpha's face, chasing away the shadows, and Kale saw not a commander, not a soldier, but his partner, his Alpha, his beginning. The final scene mirrored the first, a perfect poetic inversion. Kale sat not on a sterile cot, but on the rich, dark soil of the earth, far from the shadow of the spire, which was now just a silver needle on the horizon. His spine was not straight with conditioned compliance, but was relaxed, leaning against the solid warmth of Valerius's chest. The air did not taste of nothing. It was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a complex, living perfume. His world was no longer a shadowless white room, but a vast, open landscape of greens and browns under a brilliant, impossibly blue sky. They had found one of the freehold settlements Valerius had spoken of, a small, resilient community of outcasts and runaways tucked into a hidden valley. They had been met with suspicion, but Valerius's knowledge of spire technology and Kyle's gentle, unassuming nature had eventually earned them a tentative welcome. It was a hard life, a life of subsistence and constant vigilance, but it was a life of their own choosing. Valerius's arms were wrapped around him from behind, his chin resting on Kyle's shoulder. It was a casual, comfortable embrace, an intimacy that had become as natural as breathing. They were watching a group of children who had been born free, playing in a meadow, their laughter carrying on the wind. It was a sound of pure, unconditioned joy, a sound Kale was still learning to fully comprehend. "I never knew," Kale whispered, his gaze on the vast, open sky. "I never knew there was so much space." "I had forgotten," Valerius murmured into his ear, his voice a low, contented rumble. "In the spire, every centimeter is measured, allocated, and controlled. Out here, it just is." Kale leaned back, tilting his head to look at the Alpha. The severe, haunted man he had first met was gone. The lines of stress around his eyes had softened. The storm in his gaze had calmed, leaving a sky that was clear and deep. He was still a warrior, a protector, but the war was no longer inside him. He reached up, his fingers tracing the faint scar on Valerius's jaw. "Are you happy?" he asked. Valerius considered the question for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the valley, the small, rugged settlement, and finally coming to rest on Cale's face. A slow, genuine smile touched his lips, a rare and precious thing that transformed his entire countenance. "I am at peace, Cale," he said, and Cale knew it was a deeper, more profound truth than simple happiness. "I spent my whole life fighting the wrong enemy. The enemy wasn't chaos, it was fear." He leaned down and kissed Kyle, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of freedom and promise. The bond between them was no longer a secret, a forbidden spark in the dark. It was a quiet, steady flame that warmed them both. They were not just survivors. They were builders, laying the foundation of a new life, one truth at a time. A scout from the settlement was jogging towards them from the perimeter, her expression serious. The fight was not over. The spire was still out there, a monolithic symbol of control, and they were a dangerous, living proof of its failure. Sooner or later, Thorn's reach would extend even here. There would be more battles to fight, a larger rebellion to fuel. But as Valerius's hand tightened on his, Cale felt no fear. He looked out at the horizon, at the endless expanse of the world, and he knew he was no longer Subject 734, an asset in a cage. He was Kyle, an Omega, a free man, and he was loved. The future was uncertain, a wild, untamed land stretching out before them. But they would face it together. He was no longer off limits. He was home.